In the glittering world of fine dining, where appearances often dictate treatment and assumptions rule supreme, Maison Étoile stood as a beacon of culinary excellence. But beneath its pristine surface, a darkness lurked that would shake its very foundation. When Jane Mitchell walked into her husband's acclaimed restaurant that fateful evening, she never imagined that being deliberately ignored would unleash a chain of events that would transform not just one prejudiced waiter's life, but the entire hospitality industry. What began as a quiet act of discrimination would evolve into a powerful story of redemption, proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin with a single empty water glass and an unserved menu. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Maison Étoile, painting golden streaks across the pristine white tablecloths. Jane Mitchell smoothed her navy blue dress as the hostess led her to a corner table, her heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. The restaurant, her husband David's pride and joy, hummed with the gentle murmur of conversation and the delicate clink of fine china. "Would you like me to take your coat, madam?" the hostess asked with a warm smile, her practiced movements reflecting the establishment's reputation for impeccable service. "Yes, thank you," Jane replied, shrugging off her light jacket. She'd chosen this particular table countless times before. It offered the perfect vantage point to observe both the dining room and the careful choreography of the staff as they attended to their guests. As she settled into her chair, Jane couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in atmosphere around her. A solo diner was something of a rarity in an establishment like Maison Étoile, where tables were typically reserved weeks in advance by couples celebrating special occasions or business executives securing important deals over expertly prepared cuisine. The waiter assigned to her section, a tall man with sharp features whom she recognized as Alex, seemed to be deliberately avoiding eye contact. She'd seen him before during her visits to the restaurant, but they'd never formally interacted. While he gracefully attended to the elderly couple at the adjacent table, refilling their water glasses and explaining the day's specials with enthusiasm, he appeared to look straight through Jane as if she were invisible. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Jane watched as Alex served other newly seated guests, his movements fluid and attentive, everywhere except her table. She observed him sharing a joke with a group of businessmen, his laughter carrying across the room as he took their drink orders. The contrast in his behavior was stark and unmistakable. A young couple was seated at the table directly across from Jane. Within moments, Alex appeared at their side, presenting menus with a flourish and launching into a detailed description of the chef's recommendations. Jane's menu remained untouched at the edge of her table, her water glass empty. The weight of being deliberately ignored settled uncomfortably on her shoulders, but years of experiencing similar treatment had taught her to maintain her composure. She'd faced this before: the assumptions, the prejudices, the subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination. As a successful businesswoman herself, she learned to handle such situations with dignity, though each occurrence still stung. Another server, Marie, passed by with a concerned glance at Jane's table. She seemed to hesitate, clearly noting the lack of service but uncertain about stepping into another waiter's section. Jane offered her a small smile, acknowledging the awkward situation without drawing attention to it. The minutes ticked by, marked by the steady rhythm of dining room activity around her. Jane pulled out her phone, checking the time. David was running later than usual for their weekly dinner date. She could have easily announced herself as the owner's wife, could have demanded proper service, but that wasn't her way. Besides, these moments, though unpleasant, often revealed important truths about people's characters. Through the restaurant's front windows, she watched as the sky transformed from golden afternoon to dusky evening. The lighting in the dining room adjusted automatically, creating an even more intimate atmosphere. The sommelier wheeled his cart past her table, stopping to make recommendations to other diners while pointedly avoiding her section. Jane's attention was drawn to a small commotion at a nearby table, where Alex was expertly dealing with a spilled glass of red wine. His professionalism was evident as he quickly contained the situation, replacing the tablecloth with practiced efficiency and offering sincere apologies to the affected guests. The incident only served to highlight the stark contrast in how he was choosing to treat her. She found herself wondering about Alex's story, what experiences or beliefs had shaped his prejudices. In her position as a business consultant, Jane had learned that discrimination often stemmed from deeply rooted biases people weren't even aware they carried. Still, understanding the source didn't make the experience any less degrading. The restaurant had nearly reached its full dinner capacity now, the buzz of conversation growing louder as more patrons arrived. The maitre d' surveyed the room with pride, ensuring everything ran smoothly. His eyes skipped over Jane's table just as Alex's had, either not noticing or choosing to ignore the obvious gap in service. Just as Jane was considering whether to leave, something she'd never had to contemplate at her own restaurant before, she caught sight of a familiar figure through the front window. David's silhouette appeared, his tall frame unmistakable as he approached the entrance. She felt a mixture of relief and anticipation, knowing the evening was about to take an interesting turn. The maitre d' rushed to greet David, his face lighting up with recognition. As David made his way through the dining room, heads turned slightly, not just because he was the owner, but because he carried himself with natural authority and warmth. He spotted Jane and smiled, but she could see in his eyes that he'd already noticed something was amiss at her table. Alex, who had been serving a dessert course to the elderly couple, froze mid-motion as he realized who had just entered. His eyes darted between David and Jane, and for the first time that evening, he truly saw her. The color drained from his face as understanding dawned. The woman he'd been deliberately ignoring for the past 45 minutes was none other than Mrs. Mitchell, the owner's wife. As David approached their table, Jane maintained her composed demeanor, but there was a slight gleam in her eye. The evening's uncomfortable experience was about to become a valuable lesson in equality and respect, one that would resonate through the halls of Maison Étoile for quite some time to come. David's warm hand squeezed Jane's shoulder as he bent to kiss her cheek, his eyes scanning the empty table with growing concern. The lack of water, menu, or any sign of service told him everything he needed to know. He'd built Maison Étoile's reputation on exemplary service and attention to detail. What he saw before him was anything but. "How long have you been waiting, darling?" David asked quietly, taking his seat across from her. His tone was gentle, but Jane could detect the underlying tension in his voice. "About 45 minutes, Jane replied, keeping her voice steady. "I've had quite an interesting anthropological experience, watching how different guests are treated." She managed a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In the 15 years they'd been married, he'd witnessed countless instances of discrimination directed at his wife, and each time it ignited a quiet fury within him. But like Jane, he'd learned the value of measured responses. From his peripheral vision, he could see Alex hovering uncertainly near the service station, clearly unsure whether to approach the table. The waiter's earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by visible anxiety as he realized the gravity of his actions. "Tell me about your observations," David said, folding his hands on the table. It was a technique they developed over years of dealing with similar situations, allowing Jane to process the experience through analytical distance. "Well," Jane began, her voice taking on the professional tone she used in her consulting work. Our waiter, Alex, has demonstrated quite remarkable versatility in his service style. For the elderly couple to our left, he's been the picture of attentive patience. For the business group in the corner, he's shown wonderful jovial energy. She paused, taking in Alex's increasingly uncomfortable posture as he pretended to reorganize wine glasses at the service station. For me, however, he's perfected the art of selective invisibility. Quite impressive, really, how someone can look straight through a person as if they're made of glass. Other staff members had begun to notice the tension building in their section. Marie, the server who had noticed Jane's situation earlier, was whispering urgently to the maitre d', whose face had taken on an ashen hue as he glanced toward their table. David reached across the table and took Jane's hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I'm sorry you had to experience this, especially here, of all places." "Don't be," Jane replied, squeezing his hand. "Sometimes these moments are necessary. They remind us why we work so hard to change things." She'd built her consulting career around helping companies create more inclusive environments, and ironically, it seemed her husband's restaurant needed some of that expertise. The maitre d' approached their table with hurried steps, Alex reluctantly trailing behind him. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell," the maitre d' began, his voice strained with anxiety, "I cannot express how deeply." David held up a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. "Thomas, I appreciate your concern, but I believe Alex should be the one speaking right now." His voice was calm, but carried an authority that made Alex visibly flinch. The young waiter stepped forward, his earlier prejudice replaced by evident shame. "Mr. Mitchell, Mrs. Mitchell, he started, then faltered, his rehearsed excuses dying on his lips as he met Jane's steady gaze. "Yes, Alex?" Jane prompted, her tone professional and measured. "I believe this is the first time you've addressed me this evening, despite my having been here for..." She glanced at her watch, nearly an hour now. The surrounding tables had grown quieter, the regular dinner ambience giving way to subtle observation of the unfolding scene. Alex's hands fidgeted with his order pad, his knuckles white from gripping it too tightly. I have no excuse for my behavior," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Actually," Jane replied, her voice taking on the tone she used in her diversity training sessions, "I think you do have reasons. They might not be good ones, they might not be ones you're proud of, but they exist. The question is, are you ready to examine them?" David watched his wife with quiet pride. Even in the face of blatant discrimination, she maintained her ability to turn difficult moments into opportunities for growth. It was one of the countless reasons he'd fallen in love with her. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Alex struggled to find words. Around them, other servers continued their duties with exaggerated focus, trying to maintain normal service while being acutely aware of the tension in their midst. "I made assumptions," Alex finally admitted, his voice shaky but gaining strength as he forced himself to continue. "When I saw you sitting alone, I let my prejudices affect my professional duties. I convinced myself you weren't a priority customer." Jane nodded slowly, acknowledging his honesty. "And how did those assumptions work out for you, Alex?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Alex's face flushed deeper as he realized not only had he failed at basic human decency, but he'd also made a massive professional miscalculation. "I think," David interjected, his voice firm but not unkind, "we should continue this conversation in my office tomorrow morning. For now, Thomas will take over our table." He looked at the maitre d', who nodded quickly and began to step forward. "Actually," Jane said, raising her hand slightly, "I'd prefer if Marie served us." She smiled at the young waitress who had shown concern earlier. "I noticed her integrity earlier this evening. Those are the qualities we value at Maison Étoile, aren't they, David?" David nodded, understanding the message his wife was sending. Excellence wasn't just about perfect service. It was about character, about treating every person with equal respect and dignity. As Alex retreated and Marie approached with menus, the regular rhythm of the restaurant slowly resumed. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of Maison Étoile that evening, a reminder that true hospitality knew no boundaries, and that sometimes the most important lessons came from unexpected moments. The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds in David's office, casting striped shadows across his mahogany desk. It was barely 9 a.m., an hour before Maison Étoile would open for lunch service, and the tension in the room was palpable. Alex sat rigidly in one of the leather chairs facing the desk, his uniform pressed immaculately, a stark contrast to his obvious discomfort. David stood by the window, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The events of the previous evening had kept him awake most of the night, his mind wrestling with the appropriate response to such a clear violation of everything his restaurant stood for. "Do you know why I named it Maison Étoile?" David finally broke the silence, still looking out the window. Without waiting for Alex's response, he continued, "It means star house in French. When I opened this restaurant, I wanted it to be a guiding light in the culinary world, not just for its food, but for its values." He turned to face Alex, his expression stern but not unkind. "When I met Jane 15 years ago, she was already a rising star in corporate consulting, specializing in diversity and inclusion. She taught me that true excellence isn't just about what you serve on the plate. It's about how you make people feel when they walk through your doors." Alex shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his gaze fixed on his hands folded in his lap. "Mr. Mitchell, I want to apologize again for my behavior. I know what I did was wrong." "Wrong doesn't begin to cover it, Alex," David interrupted, finally taking his seat behind the desk. "What you did last night wasn't just unprofessional, it was cruel. And the irony is, you did it to the very person who helped shape our service policies." He pulled out a folder from his desk drawer and opened it. "Your service record here has been exemplary until now. Countless positive reviews, excellent tips, perfect attendance. Which makes your behavior last night even more disturbing. It suggests this wasn't a lapse in judgment, it was a deliberate choice." The young waiter's face flushed with shame. I don't know what to say, sir. I've never thought of myself as prejudiced, but last night made me realize I have biases I wasn't even aware of." "At least you're honest about it now," David acknowledged, leaning back in his chair. "But here's what troubles me most. How many other guests have you treated this way? How many people have left Maison Étoile feeling less than welcome because of similar assumptions you've made about them?" The question hung heavy in the air. Alex's silence was answer enough. "I've spent the morning speaking with other staff members," David continued, his voice measured. "Marie told me about similar incidents she's observed over the past few months. Nothing as blatant as last night, but a pattern of subtle discrimination that she felt uncomfortable reporting." Alex's head snapped up, surprise and defensiveness flashing across his face. "Mr. Mitchell, Let me finish." David held up his hand. "Thomas, our maitre d', also admitted to noticing these behaviors, but chose to look the other way because you're one of our most efficient servers. That's two problems I need to address. Your discriminatory behavior and a management team that failed to confront it. He stood up and walked to a framed photograph on the wall, a picture from Maison Étoile's opening night. In it, David and Jane stood proudly in front of the restaurant, surrounded by their first team of staff members. When we opened this restaurant, Jane insisted that our mission statement include a commitment to inclusive hospitality, not as a marketing tool, but as a fundamental principle. Turning back to Alex, David's expression softened slightly. You're a talented server, Alex. Your technical skills are impressive, but technical skills without humanity are worthless in this industry. What happens now? Alex asked quietly, finally meeting David's gaze. David returned to his desk and pulled out another document. That depends partly on you. I'm putting you on 2 weeks probation, during which you'll work closely with Jane's consulting firm. They're going to provide intensive diversity and inclusion training, not just for you, but for our entire staff. We're using this incident as a catalyst for change. Alex's eyes widened in surprise. He had clearly been expecting immediate termination. This isn't leniency, David clarified. Reading Alex's expression, this is an opportunity to prove that you can learn and grow from this mistake. Jane believes in second chances. It's one of her many admirable qualities. But make no mistake, this is your only second chance. He pushed the probation agreement across the desk. The training will be unpaid, and you'll be working reduced hours at base pay for the duration. If you're not interested in this opportunity for growth, you can submit your resignation now, and we'll part ways professionally. Alex reached for the document with a slightly trembling hand. I want to learn from this, Mr. Mitchell. I want to be better. Good, David nodded. Because starting next week, Jane will be conducting weekly diversity training sessions for our entire staff. And you, Alex, will be sharing your experience as a case study in how unconscious bias can poison even the most professional environment. The young waiter swallowed hard but nodded. Yes, sir. I understand. One more thing, David added, his voice taking on an edge of steel. If I ever witness or hear about you discriminating against any guest, regardless of their appearance, status, or any other factor, you'll be terminated immediately. Is that clear? Crystal clear, sir. As Alex signed the probation agreement, David couldn't help but think about Jane's reaction when he discussed this plan with her late last night. She'd smiled that knowing smile of hers and said, sometimes the best way to eliminate darkness is not to cast it out, but to transform it into light. The private dining room of Maison Étoile had been transformed into a makeshift training space. The elegant dining tables were pushed to one side, replaced by rows of chairs facing a projection screen. Jane stood at the front of the room, her professional demeanor masking any lingering personal feelings about the incident that had prompted this gathering. It was 8 a.m., and the entire staff, from the executive chef to the dishwashers, sat attentively, their usual pre-service routines postponed for this mandatory training session. Alex sat in the front row, his posture stiff but attentive, a notebook open on his lap. Good morning, everyone, Jane began, her voice warm but authoritative. Many of you know me as Mrs. Mitchell, David's wife. Today, I'm here as Jane Anderson Mitchell, founder of Inclusive Horizons Consulting. We're going to have an honest conversation about something that affects every aspect of the hospitality industry: unconscious bias. She clicked to the first slide, which showed a simple image of Maison Étoile's exterior. This restaurant isn't just a business, it's a community space. Every person who walks through those doors brings their own story, their own worth, and their own right to be treated with dignity. From the back of the room, Thomas, the maitre d', shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The past week had forced him to confront his own role in enabling discriminatory behavior through his silence. Last week, Jane continued, her eyes scanning the room, an incident occurred that brought to light some uncomfortable truths about our establishment. But rather than dwelling on the negative, we're going to use it as a catalyst for positive change. She gestured to Alex, who stood up slowly, his face flushed but determined. Alex has agreed to share his perspective on how unconscious bias can manifest in ways we might not even realize. Alex? Taking a deep breath, Alex faced his colleagues. A week ago, I thought I was one of the best servers in this restaurant. My tips were good, my reviews were excellent, and I took pride in my professionalism. But I failed to recognize how my own prejudices were affecting my behavior. The room was silent as Alex recounted the events of that evening, not sparing himself any uncomfortable details. He described his automatic assumptions, his deliberate avoidance, and the moment he realized his grave error. The worst part, he concluded, his voice slightly shaky, was realizing that this wasn't a one-time mistake. Looking back, I could see a pattern in how I treated certain guests differently based on snap judgments. I'm here to learn, to change, and to do better. Jane stepped forward again as Alex sat down. Thank you, Alex. That kind of honesty takes courage. She clicked to the next slide, which displayed a series of guest photos from the restaurant's social media. Let's play a game called Assumptions. Look at these photos and write down your first impressions about these guests. What they might order, how much they might spend, what kind of service they'd expect. The staff members scribbled in their notebooks, some looking increasingly uncomfortable as they recognized their own biases emerging on paper. Now, Jane continued, I'm going to tell you the real stories behind these photos. She pointed to an image of a modestly dressed, elderly woman dining alone. This guest is Dr. Sarah Chun, a renowned neurosurgeon who just completed a 12-hour surgery. She orders our most expensive wine by the bottle and has single-handedly referred over 50 high-profile guests to our restaurant. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the room as Jane continued through the photos, systematically dismantling common assumptions about guests based on appearance, dining companions, or behavior. The cost of bias isn't just moral, it's financial, Jane explained, switching to a slide with statistics. Studies show that restaurants losing business due to discriminatory service practices sacrifice an average of 20% potential revenue annually. But more importantly, they lose something far more valuable, their integrity. She walked among the staff, making eye contact with each person. Every time a guest leaves feeling diminished, we've failed not just in our professional duties, but in our human obligations. Excellence in service means excellence in humanity. The training continued with role-playing exercises, group discussions, and practical scenarios. Jane introduced tools for recognizing and counteracting unconscious bias, emphasizing that change was a continuous process, not a single moment of revelation. During a brief break, Marie approached Jane with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Mitchell, I want to apologize for not speaking up sooner about what I observed. I was afraid of causing trouble. Jane touched the young server's arm gently. Marie, you showed concern that night, which was more than many did. But you're right. We all have a responsibility to speak up. That's why we're implementing a new feedback system where staff can report concerns anonymously. As the session drew to a close, Jane presented each staff member with a small mirror mounted on a card. Keep these at your service stations, she instructed. Before you approach any table, take a quick look at yourself, not to check your appearance, but to remind yourself to reflect on your assumptions. Let it be a moment of reset, of remembering that every guest deserves your best self. David, who had been observing quietly from the doorway, stepped forward to address his staff. Starting today, Maison Étoile's service standards will be measured not just by technical precision, but by the equality of our welcome. This training isn't a one-time event. It's the beginning of a new chapter in our restaurant story. As the staff began to disperse to prepare for lunch service, Alex lingered behind. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said softly, "thank you for this opportunity to learn rather than simply being dismissed. I won't waste it." Jane smiled, seeing genuine transformation beginning to take root. "Thank you, Alex, for being willing to learn. Sometimes our greatest mistakes can lead to our most important growth." 3 months had passed since that pivotal evening, and Maison Étoile had undergone a subtle but profound transformation. The physical space remained as elegant as ever, but there was a new warmth in the atmosphere that went beyond the ambient lighting and sophisticated decor. Jane sat at her usual corner table, this time intentionally alone, observing the evening service with quiet satisfaction. The changes were evident in 100 small ways. Servers approaching each table with the same genuine enthusiasm, regardless of the guest's appearance. The maitre d' giving equal attention to solo diners and large parties. And most notably, Alex demonstrating a complete transformation in his approach to service. She watched as Alex gracefully attended to an elderly woman dining alone, pulling out her chair with genuine respect and spending time carefully explaining the evening's specials. The woman, initially hesitant and perhaps expecting to be overlooked, visibly relaxed under his attentive but natural service. "Your usual Bordeaux, Mrs. Mitchell?" Marie appeared at her side with a warm smile. "Yes, thank you, Marie. And how are the mentoring sessions going?" Following the training, Marie had been promoted to lead the newly established Hospitality Excellence Committee, where she helped implement ongoing diversity and inclusion initiatives. Her previous reluctance to speak up had transformed into confident leadership. "Wonderful," Marie beamed. "We're actually using the incident from 3 months ago as a case study for new hires." Alex has been incredibly open about sharing his experience. It's powerful to hear how awareness can change perspective. As Marie moved away to fetch the wine, Jane noticed David emerging from the kitchen, where he'd been discussing menu modifications to accommodate various dietary restrictions and cultural preferences. Their eyes met across the room, and his smile carried the pride of seeing their shared vision coming to life. The restaurant had recently been featured in a prominent hospitality magazine, not for its exceptional cuisine, though that remained stellar, but for its groundbreaking approach to inclusive service. The article had highlighted how Maison Étoile had transformed a potentially damaging incident into an opportunity for industry-wide change. Thomas, the maitre d', approached her table with a tablet in hand. "Mrs. Mitchell, I wanted to share something with you." He pulled up the restaurant's latest guest feedback metrics. "Our satisfaction scores have increased by 30% across all demographic groups, and our repeat customer rate has grown significantly among solo diners and diverse clientele." Jane nodded appreciatively. The numbers were impressive, but what touched her more were the personal stories. Like the thank you note she'd received last week from a woman in a wheelchair who wrote about feeling truly welcomed for the first time in an upscale restaurant. Or the elderly gentleman who commented that he no longer felt rushed or dismissed when dining alone. Alex appeared at her table, carrying a small plate with an elegantly plated appetizer. "Chef's compliments, Mrs. Mitchell. He's testing a new dish and would value your opinion." His manner was professional yet genuine, worlds away from the waiter who had ignored her 3 months ago. "Thank you, Alex. And how are your Tuesday evening hospitality workshops going?" After completing his probation, Alex had surprised everyone by volunteering to lead weekly discussions about service excellence and inclusion for the staff. His personal journey from bias to awareness had made him a compelling advocate for change. "They're making a real difference," he replied, his eyes reflecting sincere engagement. "Last week, we had servers from 3 other restaurants join us. Word is spreading about what we're doing here." As Alex moved on to his other tables, David joined Jane, sliding into the seat across from her. "Remember when you said sometimes the best way to eliminate darkness is to transform it into light?" he asked, reaching for her hand across the table. "I do," she smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "Well, look around," he gestured to the bustling dining room. "Every table tells a story of transformation. Not just Alex's story, but our whole team's journey toward true hospitality." The evening light filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow across the dining room. At nearby tables, a young couple celebrated their engagement. An elderly man enjoyed a solo dinner while reading a book, and a family with small children was being attended to with the same polished service as the business executives in the corner. "We've created something special here," Jane observed, "something that goes beyond fine dining. We've created a model for change." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And it all started with one uncomfortable evening that forced us to confront our blind spots. Sometimes the best lessons come from our most challenging moments." As the evening progressed, Jane watched the seamless dance of service unfold around her. Each guest treated with equal respect, each interaction marked by genuine warmth. Maison Étoile had always been known for its stellar cuisine and elegant atmosphere, but now it shone with an even brighter light, the light of true inclusivity. The incident that had sparked this transformation was now part of the restaurant's lore, not as a story of shame, but as a testament to the possibility of change. In the end, Maison Étoile had lived up to its name, becoming not just a star in the culinary world, but a guiding light for the entire hospitality industry. As the last rays of sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues, Jane raised her glass in a quiet toast to transformation, to second chances, and to the power of turning difficult moments into opportunities for growth. In the warm glow of the restaurant she and David had built together, she saw not just a successful business, but a beacon of hope for a more inclusive future.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.